Hello and welcome everybody. This is a really exciting live from the Nutrition Network. So I'm super excited to be hosting it. It is about our new sports nutrition in therapeutic carbohydrate restriction module, which is coming out at the end of the month. And we have got a whole lot of incredibly knowledgeable lecturers who have spoken in this module. It includes Prof. Noakes, who speaks about his life in sports nutrition, from high carbs to high fats, but also delves into a really exciting concept that perhaps muscle glycogen is not all it was cracked up to be, in being the key thing that results in basically you stopping exercise after a prolonged period. Tracy McBeath speaks about exercise in the modern woman, but actually she covers a whole lot of myths around exercise and how to get around them that really can be applied to anybody. Dr. Tro in this module on sports nutrition talks about low carbohydrate diets and athletic performance. He gives a really brilliant summary and the lay of the land. So after listening to his lecture, you will be sure to kind of know exactly what's going on when it comes to low carbohydrate nutrition and athletic performance. Dr. Ben is really into resistance training, and he has developed his own program regarding this called the SMART program. And he believes in exercising to fatigue, but not long periods. So for those of us who don't like exercising forever and ever, Dr. Ben's way of exercise is really the way to go. And interestingly, he is incredibly highly qualified, even though he looks like a muscle builder. And he has got years and years of experience in academia and in practice. So a lot of really interesting information that he gives in his lecture. We also have Laurie Roth, professor from sports science in Cape Town, and he talks about his journey with overcoming traumatic brain injury and why motivation and goal setting is so crucial to exercise. Dr. Andre Obrovic is a coach, and he speaks about implementing exercise in his coaching practice, and also about the importance of aerobic exercise. And then Emeritus Professor Holden McRae speaks about metabolic flexibility for both low and higher intensity exercise. So really exciting to have some of those lecturers here. And I'm excited to speak to each of them a little bit and ask some key pertinent questions related to the lectures that they've given in the sports nutrition course. So who to start with? That's the question. I think let's start with a big name, Prof. Noakes, because I think that, you can say save the most cutting edge, maybe contentious topic for last, but I think this is really important, so I don't want it to be missed. Prof. Noakes, you purport in your lectures, and you give 3 lectures in this module, that muscle glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose in the muscles, which was always thought to be the limiting factor when it came to sustained exercise performance. You want a carb load so that you can, pack lots of carbs into that muscle storage so that you don't get tired. And you want to take a lot of, exogenous carbohydrate supplements during your exercise over prolonged periods so that you don't deplete your muscle glycogen stores. And then when you finish exercising, you must take a whole lot more carbs as well to just get those muscle glycogen stores back up to where they were. And before you exercise, I did mention carb loading to get those muscle glycogen stores high as well, because they're the limiting factor. Now you're saying that all of this scientific knowledge that we have believed in over the last decades regarding muscle glycogen may not be all it was cracked up to be. Can you tell us a little bit around this theory, please?
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. Happy to do that. To start with, you mentioned the limiting factor. And that implies that the body has no control of the future. It just runs until it runs out of something, and then you collapse. And that's not how the body works. The body works always under homeostatic control. And this just went missing in the exercise sciences. When sports science became very popular in the 1960s, and in fact before that, The argument was that you ran out of something and that's why you got fatigued. No one could conceptualize that the brain is there to make sure that that never happens, and that fatigue is a mechanism to make sure you don't get into trouble. But now, what I can tell you absolutely certainly is muscle glycogen cannot be the limiting factor, because if it was, what would happen is the muscle would run out of energy and it would go into rigor, muscle rigor, which is a fatal condition. If your muscle actually went into muscle rigor, it would release all these bad enzymes and poisons, and your kidneys would fail and you would die. Now, that doesn't happen. I've watched sport for 70 years and I haven't noticed that happening very often. So clearly that's not the case. So I lovely to see Holden McRae here. Hi, Holden, because Holden in 1981 was one of our very first honors students in sports science, and he will remember the lectures I gave on how glycogen is the crucial factor. So why did I tell Holden a lot of nonsense? And the answer was because I started my sports science career in 1976. And what was happening at that time was this new technique had been developed by the Scandinavians, the muscle biopsy technique. And this was simply the most influential new technique in sports science, because now everyone could measure the limiting factor. So we could measure the glycogen, and now we could tell the athlete, this is the problem and this is the solution. So we all went down that route and believed it. And we believed the evidence that was produced in 1967. There was a series of about 10 papers. And I mean, they were so convincing. One of them was these guys carbo-loaded before a 30-kilometer run. And then the other race, they didn't carbo-load. And the difference in performance was something like 15 minutes. Now, imagine if tomorrow a paper came out and it said, you can improve your performance by 15 minutes by doing X. And what they were suggesting you do wasn't very difficult. You just had to eat more carbs. So of course the world fell over backwards, and they didn't look at the data carefully. And I only looked at the data carefully about 9 months ago. And for reasons, I decided to write this article and look at low carbs and exercise performance. And I noticed that unfortunately, when the people did these studies measuring muscle glycogen, they also measured blood glucose. And everyone knew already in the 1920s that low blood glucose impairs performance. And these people noticed, well, they saw that blood glucose levels were equally incredibly low at the time that the muscle glycogen was low. So you could not conclude that it was muscle glycogen depletion that was causing fatigue, because you had two competing factors. And when I went back and looked over all the literature, it was clear to me that hypoglycemia was always developing in the exercise where the performance was impaired. There was always early onset of hypoglycemia, and then 30 minutes later, the performance would start to fall off. And so then I looked at that and I found 40 studies where supposedly muscle glycogen was the factor, when it wasn't, because when you looked at the control condition, the control athletes all became hypoglycemic. So the glucose was working by preventing hypoglycemia in the control group. So that's the evidence. And I mean, fortunately, we are doing some work with a group in Pennsylvania, and it's really very exciting because we're looking at low carb diets, and we find no difference in performance. And the latest data we have is from 1 mile repetitions and 800-meter repetitions. So we had these guys do 6 times 800-meter repetitions, because that will definitely deplete muscle glycogen. So if they were to say, oh, you see, but the reason you don't find an effect is that because the athletes still have too much muscle glycogen when they start. So we said, fine, let's see what happens. And we've discovered something really exciting, that the longer they go, the more fat they burn. And that's the more repetitions they do. Their performance doesn't drop off, but they reach these astronomical rates of fat oxidation, which have never been measured. So the traditional way to measure fat oxidation is you take an athlete at 60% of VO2 max and you have them run for as long as they can, and then you measure the fat oxidation. And if the athlete's fat adapted, you can get up to 1.2 grams per minute. We're getting values substantially higher than that in people doing high intensity exercise.
Wow.
So
So,
it's
Prof, that's
completely,
completely against the whole idea that you
yeah,
can, up to 60% VO2 max, you're going to have to cross over to primarily carb burning.
yeah.
Um, yeah. So
And
this is
in
saying
fact,
very high intensity. We can
yeah,
still
and so
burn
we
fat.
found in during the VO2 max test that these athletes who were fat adapted, up to 85% of VO2 max, they were still burning 50% of the energy from fat. So, and they even at 90% and 95%, they were still getting a substantial amount from fat, which is completely contrary to the dogmas.
So is
So,
that why blood glucose? Because you said that it's not muscle glycogen that is limiting sustained performance. It's not a drop in muscle glycogen. It is rather a drop in blood glucose levels that is resulting in that reduction in exercise performance over time. But then someone who's eating a low carb diet, they're going to have relatively low blood glucose. I've seen some carnivores with, what would be classified as hypoglycemic blood glucose levels of less than 4 millimole per liter. So would they then not be able to exercise?
yeah, so now Laurie Rauch is also on this. And so when I went back and looked at some of his work, and maybe he'll address it, and he would say exactly the same, that one of the earliest studies we did on high-fat diets, and I'm sure he was a co-author, this was in 1994, believe it or not. Because so Jeff Volek did the first sort of study in 1984 showing high-fat diets could be at least be equal performance, didn't get worse. In 1994, we did 2 studies, and both of them showed improved performance. But then, and I wondered, I went and looked at the second one, in which athletes had exercised for a long time, and then they'd done performance trial. And the performance trial, they were exercised for much longer on the high-fat diet. And I looked at the glucoses, and it was beautiful, because the blood glucose fell less rapidly in the fat-adapted group, and they continued to a lower blood glucose level before they stopped. So the explanation there was, it was apparent that they delayed the onset of hypoglycemia and they could go to lower levels. And to answer your question, that's because they're burning ketones. And I've just had a letter from Jeff Volek because I'm working with him on some stuff. And he said, don't forget the studies where they took people and infused them with insulin and got their glucose down to about 2, and their brain was functioning normally if they were in ketosis. So that would be the reason, so that you get the double.
The brain is able to use an alternative fuel source. So you're basically able to go to a lower blood glucose before the central governor is controlling you to reduce your performance for safety's sake, than if you were solely reliant on glucose as your main or your brain's main substrate. And so you can actually just go to much lower blood glucose levels before you suffer clinical hypoglycemia or exercise induce or exercise reduction due to a relative hypoglycemia. Would you say
Correct.
That's the case?
And
Okay.
one of our ambassadors for the Noakes Foundation cycles eats no carbs, and he cycles hundreds of kilometers a day and without glucose. And he chided me on Twitter a few days ago when I said that you could adapt within 4 weeks to the low carb diet. He said, no, it takes years. Wow. And he simply does not eat carbohydrates, yet he can cycle. So his liver so one of 2 things has happened. Either his brain doesn't need glucose anymore, it can use purely ketones, or his liver has upregulated its glucose production. And again, thanks, I see Peter's here, Peter Cummins. I don't know if John Cripps is here today, but he sent me this lovely article showing that, I worked out that gluconeogenesis in the glycogenolysis in the liver, and gluconeogenesis must be driven by fats, because you've got all these fats, and it's completely it's not frequently said. And he found a study show that there is a pathway by which fat can go to carbohydrate in the liver. And it's complex, but it can happen. And that pathway must be activated.
Wow. So we're not only able to rely on an alternative fuel source, but we're also able to make more carbs in response to requirement during exercise.
Yeah. And the key is it's not just from protein, and it's not from lactate, it's from fats. And there had to be that pathway. I knew it would be somewhere. And
Sure.
because the human wouldn't have evolved without being able to burn fat to carbohydrate, to glucose.
So I want to ask you, this is really exciting stuff. And it's, as usual, Prof, I mean, I don't know how many times, 4, 5, 6 times you've turned dogma or traditional ideas around things on their head and come up with an alternative theory. So this is super, super exciting, but I want to just make sure that the listeners out there have an understanding of the clinical implications. If they're an athlete, do they, and also I just want to say, if anyone wants to comment or ask questions, like Peter, Holden, Tracy, it looks like we've only got you guys out of all the lecturers here, but you guys are awesome. And if you have any questions or comments based on your understanding, please interject. This can become a bit more of a discussion now. Holden, I've got a metabolic flexibility question lined up for you. I really want to find out about that. Peter, I really, really, really want to find out a bit about the amazing success you're having in your practice. So we're definitely going to get to that. And Tracy, all those problems that people are, kind of those myths around exercise that people are doing wrong, thinking wrong, and are causing them not to be able to achieve what they should be achieving. I want to talk to you about that. So these are all coming up in this next 45 minutes that we have. But before we move on to that, before we wrap up this exciting new theory that muscle glycogen isn't what we thought it was, and perhaps we've got more glucose being produced by the liver, we've got more glycogen being broken down in the liver to produce glucose as well. So the glucose is the liver is spitting out glucose through 2 pathways to allow more blood glucose when we're eating a low carb diet, and we're able to rely on ketones. So these are all reasons why low carb, can be good for athletic performance. Prof, to wrap this all up for the athlete, there are some low carb athletes who appear to need a certain amount of carbs when they are doing sustained exercise for hours on end, like marathons or those kind of things, Ironman kind of events. Why would that be if the liver of low carb people are able to produce enough glucose and we're able to run on ketones? Why are some people still turning to exogenous carbohydrates or those glucose goos or some kind of carb source during their extended exercise?
Okay, so let me make the point very, very strongly that if you're not fully 100% adapted, you will become hypoglycemic during exercise. It absolutely has to happen. And that is because your blood glucose, the use of blood glucose rises during exercise. And this is what I also discovered in writing this article, that we've always taught that carbohydrate oxidation goes down during exercise, and it does. Every time it goes down. But oxidation of glucose in the bloodstream goes up. Now, that's completely paradoxical. You would think that your blood glucose is what you must protect. And the answer is it's not. And therefore, it's serving some absolutely important
message. It's sending a message to some part of the body.
I think it's probably the brain, to keep the brain going. But it is possible that there's a tiny amount of glucose that the muscles need. Well, but we worked out it's about 20 grams an hour maximum that you need. So if your liver can't produce 20 grams of glucose an hour, or if you don't ingest 20 grams of glucose an hour, you will become hypoglycemic during exercise. And this is the argument we have with the Tour de France cyclists. Say, oh, you see, these guys, Chris Froome always takes carbohydrates during the races. And the answer is he has to, or else he's going to become hypoglycemic. But the old argument was, oh, you see, it's to fuel his muscles. And I don't, if it is, it's a tiny, tiny amount that's being used by the muscles, but most of it's being used by the brain. So yes, if you're not fully adapted, like the people who have really adapted, and I think it's because they don't eat any carbs. I think if you eat a trace of carbs, you won't make the full adaptation, but that's just a speculation.
So you'd have to go fully carnivore, in other words, basically.
Yeah. If you don't want to take carbs during exercise, you have to go fully carnivore and never eat any carbs, I would think. But anyway, it's a small price. You see, 20 grams of carbs per hour in a race is nothing. And you don't even have to start from the first hour. You could probably go from the third or the fourth or the fifth hour.
So that's like 4 teaspoons of some kind of carb, really. So that could be in the form of like a banana, or in the form of a goo, God forbid, or in the form of, something like that, right?
Absolutely. But what you're told is you have to take 100 grams an hour. And that's completely wrong, that you don't need 100 grams an hour.
Even the 50 grams an hour is more than double, because there are some traditional recommendations for 50 grams an hour. And even that is double what you're saying we actually need. That's
right. But I think the most important bit of this whole story is that showing that you don't need carbs for the average athlete. And now when I say average, I mean 95% of athletes do not need carbohydrates, to massive amounts of carbohydrate. And why is that important? Because so many athletes today are overweight, and that's a problem. And so many athletes struggle with their weight because they're being told you must eat this high carb diet. And and if you're insulin resistant, or you've got some the way the brain works, you don't quite control your calories in appropriately, you're going to get fat. And so you're going to be doing everything you possibly can. And I remember Shane Watson, who's a very, very great cricketer, whose career went right through the age of 39. And after he adapted the diet, he continued and improved his performance. He said, this was an absolute miracle for him. He was always fat as a kid, and he was always fat on the cricket field. And he had to starve himself at the start of the season. And then by the end of the season, he couldn't continue the starvation. And then he'd get fat again. And when he went on the low carb diet, he said it solved all my problems. Completely.
So for health, firstly, you don't necessarily need, well, if you're eating a very, very low carb diet, you don't need probably any carbs once you've adapted for optimal athletic performance. If you're eating some carbs, but you're still eating a low carb or ketogenic diet, you probably would need up to a maximum of like 20 grams after the first hour of sustained exercise. And then would you say that regular carb eating people also could get by with 20 grams, or do they need to then have the 50 to 100 grams an hour?
Well, it depends. It depends if they've eaten a high carb diet and they start exercise with lots of glycogen in the liver, then they can probably do most exercise without it. They probably need it after 2 or 3 hours. Sorry, you mentioned health. There is another thing. In this latest trial that we did in Pennsylvania, we had CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, on the athletes for 4 weeks. 4 weeks on a low carb diet and 4 weeks on a high carb diet. It's a unique data set, and it is amazing because you just see the difference in the glucose control, and you see the appearance of pre-diabetes.
Wow. Yeah, that's scary, like you saw when in your youth during that study. Prof, this is absolutely fascinating, but there are so many really awesome lecturers that we still need to get to. And I see that Professor Laurie Roch has joined us as well, which is really exciting because he's got an amazing story to tell and some really interesting insights regarding why we need to have a goal, because I kind of have always exercised without any goal, just kind of exercise because it's healthy or because I feel like getting to the beach. But Laurie says, no, you need to actually have a goal. You need to also do certain exercises to activate certain nerves. So we definitely want to talk to you about that. But while we're still on the topic of carbs and metabolism and all of this, I think let's talk to Professor Holden McRae a little bit about metabolic flexibility. What is metabolic flexibility, and how does this pertain to what Prof Noakes has just said?
Yeah, I think it ties in really well with what Prof Noakes has been talking about. Just to go back a few decades, back in the 1980s, when I'd finished sports science, I went to the University of Texas at Austin and arrived at the same time as Eddie Quayle and John Ivey, and they were working in carbohydrate metabolism as well. And one of the curious things that came out of the research, I was actually a subject in one of the studies there, is whenever they did these carbohydrate feeding studies, it would always be after not eating for 12 to 14 hours. So you carbohydrate adapted because it was the high carb period of time. You had to eat a lot of carbs. Now you can't eat for up to 14 hours. Then you go into a lab, you sit on a bike for 2 hours or more at 70 to 74% of VO2 max, which is unbearably uncomfortable. I mean, it's really a mental challenge to sit in that lab with fans blowing on you and trying to sustain the intensity. And what was curious to me always, because I taught undergraduates, that was my thing for almost 30 years, is trying to understand why these, or including me, we stopped exercising. Now, as Prof Noakes said, it was always coincided with low glucose levels, close to hypoglycemic concentrations of glucose, together with low glycogen. But if you fed carbohydrate during exercise, you would get an extra 30 minutes, or even in certain cases, up to an hour of extra exercise at the 70 to 74% of VO2 max. But then they still terminated exercise. You would still stop, even though your glucose levels were normal. So that has always confounded me. So, why are you stopping? And, the real answer is, well, your brain just says, I'm done. There's just no way you can keep going, even though you have sufficient glucose, which leads into this idea of metabolic flexibility and teaching elementary biochemistry of exercise to students. You have to really be able to tease apart what's going on with glycolysis, what's happening in the Krebs cycle, how is substrate supply affecting all these different metabolic reactions that occur in skeletal muscle. And one of the things with the work that Jeff Volek and Steve Finney did in the 1980s led me to think about, well, if we don't need high levels of glycogen storage in skeletal muscle, how is it that these individuals are able to exercise at pretty high intensities on a high-fat diet, on a carbohydrate-restricted diet? And what's happening to the glycerol molecule that is a byproduct of fat oxidation, triglyceride hydrolysis? And if you look at the metabolic pathway, glycerol, we always think of it as being a gluconeogenic precursor, that it's going to provide can provide glucose or help sustain blood glucose levels. But it can also undergo further oxidation in glycolysis and be converted to pyruvic acid. And if you look at that first step in the Krebs cycle, where citric acid is being synthesized, you have to have oxaloacetic acid combining with acetyl-CoA in order to form citric acid. Now, we know that in a carbohydrate-restricted diet, or even in prolonged exercise, you're going to have plenty of acetyl-CoA coming from fatty acid oxidation. I mean, massive amounts. You do not need pyruvate being converted to acetyl-CoA from glucose. What you really need to happen with that pyruvate is that it goes through that pyruvate carboxylase reaction to form oxaloacetic acid. You have to have sufficient quantities of oxaloacetic acid in order to form citric acid, which will then spin through the Krebs cycle and allow you to generate all the ATP you need. So I think what's happening, when we talk about metabolic flexibility, it can be either driven by diet, right? I either eat a high carbohydrate diet or I can restrict my carbohydrate diets. That'll determine what happens to the pyruvate that's formed. If I'm restricting my carbohydrate intake, a lot of that glycerol, in my opinion, and I have no data to support this, but it makes intuitive sense, is you going to, that glycerol that gets converted to 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde will go to pyruvate. It'll go through that pathway. That pyruvate will then go through the pyruvate carboxylase reaction to form oxaloacetic acid so that you can use citrate synthase to form citric acid. And all the acetyl-CoAs you need are going to be coming from beta oxidation, from fatty acid oxidation.
So that's really interesting. So what you're saying is normally glucose goes through glycolysis. So you eat carbs, you get glucose, it gets processed through the first processing step called glycolysis and becomes pyruvate. That goes through a cycle of energy production called the citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle, or tricarboxylic acid cycle. It's all the same thing. And then that goes along the electron transport chain and gets made into ATP, which is energy, basically. Okay, so there's those 3 steps. But you're saying that fatty acids, triglycerides, basically, which we know are made up of 3 chains of fat, basically, 3 fatty acid chains, and then it's attached to a glycerol backbone. I'm saying this for our audience. That glycerol backbone then is going into the same kind of, resulting in the same end product as glycolysis would have, pyruvate. And then at that point, going into that second step of the energy production cycle. And so really it's producing all of the building block, the primary building block that goes into the second step of energy production, just as much as glucose was. And that really, we don't necessarily, we're still getting all the energy we need because it's resulting in the same building block that then goes through the Krebs cycle and through the electron transport chain and into energy. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary, because if you think about it from I'm out exercising, and Prof has already alluded to the fact that you can do high intensity exercise if you've adapted to a low carb diet. There's no reason why you're going to get a limitation in performance.
Is that because you're better at breaking your fatty acids apart? Is that because you're better at making pyruvate out of the fatty acids? Is that because, like, why what's happening with that adaptation period? Maybe Peter, if you have an idea, you can also say.
Well, we know that with endurance training, you get these improvements in the capacity to oxidize fat, but you're probably going to get the same adaptations, the increased number of capillaries per muscle fiber, the increase in oxidative enzyme concentrations, more mitochondria, larger mitochondria. You get these adaptations with exercise training, endurance exercise training, that improve your capacity to use fat as a fuel.
And that's because fat is oxidized or processed under an aerobic environment. In other words, it needs to have air in the cell to be able to be processed and made into energy. Whereas glucose can be made into energy, okay, not as much energy, but it can be made into energy in an environment that hasn't got a lot of air. So if you're doing really high intensity exercise, you're going to burn more glucose because your muscles aren't going to have enough air. Or I'm simplifying it obviously, or if you haven't exercised to make yourself fitter, so you don't have as many capillaries carrying oxygen to your cells, and you don't have all these adaptations that you mentioned that makes more oxygen go to the cells, you're more inclined to burn glucose. So you're saying that exercise is going to make you able to burn the adaptations associated with exercise, like more capillaries and more mitochondria. Are you saying that is going to make you better able to burn fat? Is that what you're saying? Because there's more air, oxygen, there's a high oxygen environment.
Well, you get the shift because of the signaling that happens when you do exercise training. What people tend to forget is that complete glucose oxidation to CO2 and water, the majority of the energy in the glucose molecule is produced through aerobic respiration, right? Only 5% comes through glycolysis.
The other very little energy is made under no oxygen environment versus the oxygenated processes produce a lot more energy. So when you've got more oxygen, and that's why they say if you exercise, that's why we always knew that if you exercise at less than 60% VO2 max, in other words, you're not like really gunning it with high intensity interval training or whatever at CrossFit, then you can, running slowly, you can kind of run on fat forever.
Right. That's true. But as I said, with an adaptation to a low carbohydrate diet, so let's say you fully adapted, my guess would be that you have to also get cellular changes in the capacity to utilize that fat. Okay. So there's probably some shift that happens anatomically in terms of the mitochondrial densities, in terms of the capacity of the enzymes involved in the Krebs cycle to process the substrate.
That takes time, right? Do you think that's probably what's going on in those 4 months or more that Prof was talking about? these adaptations?
It could be, yeah. I mean, it's hypothetical, but it makes sense intuitively that that's what's happening. Yeah.
So, wow, it's really interesting. And Professor Holden goes into more detail in his lecture about, you see all of these cycles, you see all of the biochemistry, and you're probably going to have to watch the lecture a couple of times in order to kind of just wrap your head around what he's saying. But it's really interesting stuff once you understand it, because then you start to say, okay, I understand why when I'm fit, I can, and I'm low carb, I can burn a lot more fat. I can run on fat much more. And so it's really interesting stuff. And I think it's worth delving into that biochemistry. Now, Peter, I want to stick with this metabolic flexibility thing, and Holden, you can also, everyone, please, Laurie, everyone chip in, but I'm not sure I've quite got my head around the concept of metabolic flexibility. So you're saying when you're low carb, you're going to burn more fat, but are you then worse at burning carbs? Because flexibility kind of implies that you're flexible with your fuels. Like I can burn more carbs when I have more carbs, and I can burn more fat when I have more fat. That would kind of make me think of I'm flexible, right? So my understanding with regards to what you've been saying, Holden, is that you and what Prof said, you get better at burning fat. But are you actually flexible? Because what happens, are you still able to burn carbs, or are you actually, when you eat low carb and you're an athlete, are you kind of kicking yourself in the foot or whatever with your ability to burn carbs, because you're actually less metabolically flexible, you're just better at burning fat? What are your thoughts, Peter, on that? I know we're still sticking to biochem, and I want to find out about your practice and like what this means in real terms. So let's go through this as quickly as we can, and then maybe you can tell me a little bit about what you're actually achieving with your patients.
Thanks, Tamsin. What I'm not known for in this community is my sports training. I coach a stable of endurance athletes, cyclists, triathletes, professional triathletes, age groupers, and they have the same health problems as everyone else. They have the same human DNA. And my experience tells me that fitness, and I mentioned this in my presentation, is an improved ability to oxidize fat. You can see this in a ramp test after just a couple months of training someone. It seems like we're always really good at burning carbs when we need to, but we lose the ability to oxidize fat at high levels. So in part, that's the actual physical part of it is that. But I think when you use low carb, you get a biochemical advantage. And I think we can consume carbs even in the hyper exerciser, these very fit people. You can see negative biochemical changes when they overconsume carbohydrates. And I guess I would disagree with the gel. Like if I think of a fat adapted endurance athlete, I see that they need a low carb drip with not a large insulin spike versus a big bolus of, basically honey or whatever you want to call it, just liquid sugar jammed down their throat. I'm concerned about what's going to happen to their insulin and what's going to happen to lipolysis because of that, because they can go through the same things while they're exercising. So as Prof. Noakes is saying, is they just need to maintain that level of glucose based off of what he was suggesting is a little less in the beginning, but maybe increasing over duration, but it's still very relatively low compared to what athletes think. And
he said that 95% of people are unlikely to ever need that. It's only the elite, really long, doing really long rides or really long exercise,
or maybe intense as well.
Yes.
And I think that he also, like my cyclists who are racing above that 70% for large chunks of time. But he also mentions in his presentation that adding more glucose doesn't help. They don't go faster because they bring their blood sugar up to 7 millimoles. There's no evidence to set, it's not nitrous oxide. The engine can do what the engine can do. So I guess from a practical standpoint, I would just warn the athletes that's thinking about this, that we've used the word adaptation often. You really need to understand that process and go through that. And as you're adapting, just like you would be from training physically, there's adaptations that have to take place biochemically. And as they do, you can benefit from this. But if you think you're going to go do a half Ironman this weekend, and you've been using carbs throughout your training and eating a high carb diet and benefit from going low carb half Ironman day, you're making a mistake. So you need to find someone that knows what they're doing to help you go through the adaptation process, because even training can be difficult while you're going through that adaptation process. When you start trying to do harder intervals, and you haven't adapted, you may have to adjust the training or adjust your nutritional standpoint. So
that's such a good point, Peter. Sorry.
Yeah, that's just some of the things that pop into my head from what we've discussed thus far.
I can just butt in there to confirm that Peter's correct on everything he said. So the paper we've got coming out in the next few weeks is a high-fat diet improves metabolic flexibility during progressive exercise to exhaustion. And what we showed in this paper was when people did a VO2 max test, that the difference is at 50% of VO2 max, the unadapted athletes are getting 50% of their energy from carbohydrate. And from that moment on, it just increases. So from 50% of VO2 max, they're already burning 50% carbohydrate. And then thereafter, it goes up to 100%, obviously, when they're at 100%. And the difference is that the fat adapted athletes at 50% of VO2 max, they're earning 90% of the energy is coming from fat, 90%.
So only 10% from carbs.
You know what, Prof?
50% VO, just for the audience, 50% VO2 max means you're doing like half effort, right?
Yeah.
100% VO2 max means you're doing like full out effort. You're about to die. Well, not really die, not literally die. You just feel like you're going to die.
I think there's a real important point here too, especially for the long course athletes, the people that are out there for hours at a time too. You're making yourself reliant on the carbohydrates as well. So when you think about this concept of maintaining glucose at a specific level or risk your brain shutting you down, if you need a really high level of carbohydrates, you start to risk GI distress. And I've seen this in many long course athletes, especially on the run, where their glucose need is so high that they're consuming so many calories, period, and carbohydrate calories that they go through GI distress and end up in the porta potties. So there's some risk to
that's a really good point. So relying on carbs during exercise comes with risks that we don't think of, the health risks that Prof mentioned, the runner's diarrhea or other GI risk problems, which no one wants when they're on a race, as Peter's mentioned, or when they're training. Obviously, no one wants that. Also, if you're on extended events or extended, I don't know, runs or whatever, you also don't want to be carrying huge amounts of fuel with you. If you can rely on fat, then that's always going to be beneficial as well. So I think these are all really, really good points. And Peter, I really enjoyed the way you explained that you can always kind of process carbs, especially with exercise, because glucose can enter cells without insulin while you're exercising. You can process the carbs, but you're not necessarily going to be very good at processing fat unless you're fat adapted.
Yeah, so that's not where we lose. That's when we lose flexibility. It's not that we lost our flexibility to burn carbs typically.
That's a really good point. So we've only got 16 more minutes. I haven't even got to Tracy and Laurie. So I think Tracy, I'm going to rely on you for a lot of I think we're gonna sum up with you, because you are involved in the trenches with I mean, Peter's also a coach and a trainer, and he runs a very successful health practice with doctors and dietitians and nurses and everything as well. But Tracy, I think you're doing a lot of coaching, and so I definitely want to conclude with you with some real tips that can help people after all this a bit overwhelming biochem talk. But before we conclude with your take-home messages, Dr. Roch, Laurie Roch, I would like to find out about just briefly, can you tell us what happened with your traumatic brain injury? Because you're an avid cyclist, so you're speaking from personal knowledge, but you also are a lecturer at sports science, and most importantly, what I want to know is, why do I have to have a goal in mind to exercise? Why can't I just exercise? And also, why must I do, like, I know you mentioned the vagal nerve a lot, and we know that you have the fight or flight response, and we have the rest and digest responses, and you're suggesting, activate the rest and digest response, but yet I think of exercise as pretty flightish, so why would we want to involve the rest and digest stuff when we're actually trying to run? I mean, literally run. So I think if you can start quickly, because we haven't got long, and I want to leave at least a full 5 minutes for Tracy, if you could just tell me briefly what happened with your accident, and then kind of go into the goal thing, and then the rest and digest thing. So much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamsin. Yeah, our receptors are great. Is it coming through okay? Yeah.
Just keep talking, Laurie. It got better.
Okay. Yeah, I can see my work is going green. So in a nutshell, I used to cycle and train and run and swim for 30 hours a week before my accident. And after my accident, I tried to get fit again. And the more I cycled, the tired I got. So it was almost like I had a lot of sympathetic drive, but I couldn't put that sympathetic drive into like cycling performance. I wasn't getting fitter. And then I sort of realized I got to cut back on the exercise intensity. And then I realized also it's all to do with your internal environment. If you've got too much stress in your body, you can actually burn more carbohydrate, which you don't want to do. You want to burn more fat. For that, you have to cut back your sympathetic drive. So I guess that's really where my research is coming from, is how to cut back on sympathetic drive when you're exercising, because it is possible. You can go completely hyper, go very sympathetic, and you use a lot more carbohydrate than you do sympathetic. I don't know if you can hear all that, but it's basically that comes down to the atmosphere of the muscle itself.
You muted, Tamsin.
I'm muted. So what I wanted to say was, Laurie, I'm just going to summarize quickly, and if I say anything wrong, please stop me and correct me. I'm just hoping that maybe I've got the gist of what you're saying right. So you had this terrible traumatic brain injury. You couldn't walk yet, learn to walk again after your cycling accident, and eventually you were back on the bike, and you'd even lost a leg, and you were competing again, but you found that you weren't. I think it was a very stressful time in your life. You were, working hard in academia. You were lecturing. You had a new child. It was just crazy, and then you found that you weren't getting as fit as you would hope in response to that amount of training, and you found that you were burning a lot more carbs and not a lot of fat, and that you put to the sympathetic drive, which is basically your adrenaline cortisol kind of fight or flight system, rather than the rest and digest. And so what you're saying, I think, is that you wanted to find a way to reduce the fight or flight sympathetic response, which was making you not be able to burn fat and rather burn carbs, and was making you not be able to get as fit, and find a way to rather activate the parasympathetic nervous system, or parasympathetic drive, which involves the vagal nerve and the rest and digest system, in order to be able to actually get fitter, as much as conflicting as that sounds, and also be able to burn more fat rather than just rely on carbs. Is that a good summary, do you think?
Yeah, it is in a nutshell. It's also very well done there, but the main thing is at the muscle itself. So it's not a rest and digest response. It mustn't be sympathetic. So cutting your sympathetic drive, because you don't want the muscle, you don't want too much adrenaline, because this can hamper the insulin response. So I'm talking nonsense now. At the muscle itself, you don't need insulin. So when you attack the muscle, it will take the insulin up. Everywhere else you need insulin. You need to. It's like a balance. So it's more during training and during your carbohydrate, if you want to call it, getting the food.
Okay, I think
not
the
really,
reception is really
doing
bad.
exercise. It's like a
Is
whole
anyone
thing.
else? Is it just me who's
It's a
struggling?
whole-
Okay, Laurie, I'm so sorry. You have so much interesting stuff to say. And honestly, I think people are just going to have to take part in the course, really, because they're going to have to enroll to hear your lecture, because it really is fascinating. And Dr. Laurie also explains what kind of exercises to do to kind of activate the vagus nerve and to reduce the sympathetic response. And he also explains the importance of having a goal in exercise and why that is important, which was really interesting to me. So fascinating lecture that you can really learn so much about. And now I just want to conclude. And if you do have any questions, please answer. I do see we do have one question, but we don't have time to go into this very biochem heavy from Miriam Cardoni. So we will answer that after the fact. I'm sorry, we don't have time to answer that biochem heavy one. Laurie, you're creating a bit of an echo. Would you mind muting your microphone? Thank you. So Tracy, you work in the trenches with recreational athletes, with women, men, with, you work in the trenches with people who are exercising. Can you tell us, where are people going wrong? If you could, I know you give five places that really people, they almost shoot themselves in the foot, where people kind of go in with the wrong ideas and it actually massacres their own potential to get fit. But could you maybe pick out of those 5 that you discuss in your lecture, could you pick one? What is the biggest thing or biggest hurdle in people achieving their goals with regards to exercise?
If I have to pick one, that's really, really tricky. So again, people are just going to have to buy the program and look at it.
Laurie,
I
would
think,
you mind muting yourself?
Okay. So I think there's many things, and yes, I do work in the trenches. And I'd say, first of all, my goal as a coach is to get everybody who sits in front of me to see themselves as an athlete. And that is the potential of human beings. We are all athletes, women in particular, mums with so many things. We need to be pretty athletic to get through the day, just to do what we need to do. And I think, the layer I would put around every bit of conversation that we've had tonight, which is biochemistry, and is, it's fascinating. It's not my area. My area is the way people see things. And I think if you layer people's beliefs and how they see their exercise or movement, it can really change the performance. And of course, I've read studies where that's actually true. So getting our clients to really love and find joy and just really, find that newfound love under a low carb banner. I love Prof. Noakes. I've followed him for years. I was a very devout follower as a high carb personal trainer. And then I hit 40 and I was overweight and pre-diabetic, and all that stuff happened to me. And of course I found him again and followed him down the low carb rabbit hole. And I think that the benefits when you are fat adapted takes a little while to get there. That's certainly one of the things I talk about, having the time to do it. Don't expect it to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. But once we do get there, the benefits of exercise are amazing. And I think with all my clients, it's starting with the diet first. Let's get that right first. And when that does switch, 9 times out of 10, they're like, Tracy, I think I'm actually going to get up and go for a walk, or I want to do something now, because they've actually got a better metabolic burning system and they've got more energy in their day. So yeah, really just look at your beliefs, challenge them. Prof's challenging beliefs is just, everything. And I think there is just so much we can see around what is in front of us. But exercise and joy of movement, it's something that every human being on the planet is, has the possibility to do. And that's my passion.
Well, I think you've made 3 exceptional points that I think that our listeners should take home, really. Firstly, okay, this wasn't the first one, but I'm putting it first because, we're low carb and into therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, but diets. You've got to first give yourself the canvas that sets you up for success, I think. So that's the first thing. then you might feel more like it because you physiologically are more capable of it. The second thing you mentioned was the love for yourself. And I think that's really important. And enjoyment. So I'm putting those together, where exercise can be seen as a punishment. Growing up, I always thought that exercise was something someone else did, and it was unpleasant and it was a punishment. I hated exercise growing up. And then when I left school, I realized, oh, I like hiking and I like surfing and I like stand-up paddleboarding and I like kayaking, but all those things weren't offered at school, and I just thought I wasn't sporty. But the truth is, I just hadn't found something that I could express love for myself and express enjoyment in yet. I hadn't found that. School hadn't given me that. And so I think
on that, Tamsin, because I think that is really, really important. I think that's a big part of the work I do, is that, we're not running away from something. It's not about, punishment or guilt. It's about moving towards. So what is it giving us? What is the health benefits that we get from finding something that we love? And exactly that, exploring different things. If it's not the gym, it doesn't have to be the gym. I haven't set foot in a gym for years, but there is so much exercise and movement I can do if we're open to trying different things. I love that.
That's so important. And then the third one that I heard you say was that people must wait. I've got it. I had it in my head and now it's gone. So it was self-love, it was low carb, and there was something else. What was it, Tracy? What was it?
Not rushing.
Dispelling myths, challenging beliefs. So that one's really interesting as well, because that's what your whole lecture is on, right? It's on the you think that it's maybe one of the beliefs we've actually just mentioned. In me, it was, that is horrible and it's a punishment. It's challenging that belief and finding something that brings you joy, or challenging the belief that, I don't know, I don't run, or I am fat and fat people don't exercise, or whatever that incorrect belief inside your head is. Challenging that, learning. I suppose you guide people to see things a different way, so that they actually break through the barriers that are stopping them from being their best self. Is that correct?
Pretty much. I mean, we've all got stories. We've all got, beliefs around what we can and cannot do. And, the best story that I think of around this is just, a client that would say to me, I can't get up in the morning, because I'm not a morning person. I'm like, well, tell me about that. What's that all about? Where's that come from? They
can't exercise in the morning, right, if they're not a morning person. And they have no other time in the rest of the day, so you have to break through that belief. And then what did you say?
Right, which is the story and that you're believing, but that's all optional. You don't have to believe those stories. And when you start to see that and show people that, it all kind of falls away, and they are willing to try different things and explore different things, and that's just magical.
Well, Tracy, thank you so much. And I think you have to watch Tracy's lecture to find out the other big beliefs that need to be busted in order to, implement a successful individualized exercise program in the context of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. And why coaching is so important. Sorry, Peter. Yes.
Can I chime in a little bit there? I think one of the things that she touched upon is so important. A few years back, I had a mentor, Dr. Robert Gatewood, cardiologist. And I wanted to put my athletes in the same room. These are age groupers, they're doctors and they're attorneys, or, cooks or bakers, whatever. But they were in the same room as cardiac rehab patients. And he wanted to know how I saw these patients blending together. And my answer was perfectly. And he was kind of startled. And I think one of the points that Tracy was making is that we need to get people to identify with these activities as part of themselves, and moving, as she said, towards that rather than seeing it as work, or that they look forward to going for my run tonight. Because this, I think this is, as Prof. Noakes was saying as well, this is what we're really training, right? All the biochemical changes and the increased mitochondrial density, it's all great. But you have to believe you can do things before you can do them.
And that's exactly what Larry says as well in his lecture, with regards to, he fell down when learning to walk, fell down, and then he just believed he could do it, and suddenly he actually was successful. The mind is just so powerful. And you add to that the biochem behind it all, and the fact that the brain also needs glucose. And if you can combine, I think, all of those concepts that we've spoken about today, the psychology, the neurology, the biochemistry around, the muscle, around the brain, around the liver, and you can combine it all to make, happy, super healthy, super athletes, right? I think that's really the take-home message. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for being here and for contributing to the sports nutrition and therapeutic carbohydrate restriction module from the Nutrition Network. I have learned so much by watching all of your lectures and being involved in putting together this course. And I know that all of our learners, our enrollees and members will learn just as much as I have. And I actually want to watch all of them again. And I could talk to you guys forever and ever, and Prof's exciting new, ideas around muscle glycogen. And it's really, really interesting. So thank you all so much. And I hope that people really do enroll in this course and find out more about it. And there are even lecturers who weren't here who contribute more. Like, I really hope to have Dr. Ben and Andre on to have a nice debate about aerobic versus resistance training. I was so excited about that because Andre's all about aerobic cardio and Dr. Ben's all about resistance, short 10-minute bursts to fatigue. And I was like, wow, let's chat about that. That's going to be exciting. So there's so much in this course that that you can learn from. It's really awesome. And I'm so glad that we can give you a little bit of a taster. Prof, I think you wanted to say something?
No, just thank you. Thanks to everyone who participated. Really appreciate your support for the Nutrition Network and getting this message out. And you all do your contributions are so valuable and so important. Imagine if this had been around 20 or 30 years ago, all this information. We could have saved a lot of people a lot of unhappiness. But we're changing the world slowly. But thank you all for your contributions. They're really much appreciated. And thanks, Tamsin, for leading this so well. You did a brilliant job today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Prof. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening or wherever you are, morning, afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.